first saw Nomadland, the word that kept popping into my head to describe the movie was humanist. That it was a very humanist movie, maybe the most humanist I'd ever seen. Which is kind of weird because I don't think I've ever actually used that word before, and I'm not even entirely sure what it means. It just kind of felt right. I've since looked it up, and while it's hard to pin down an exact definition, let's just say emphasizing the importance of humans and their dignity, welfare, and autonomy. That's Nomadland. It's about a woman named Fern, played by Franny McDormand, who lives in her van and works temporary jobs across the American West, wherever she can find them, and mostly lives hand-to-mouth as a nomad, for lack of a better word. As she says early on in the movie,
"No, I'm not homeless. I'm just houseless. Not the same thing, right?"
No.
After Fern finishes working a seasonal job at an Amazon warehouse, she struggles to find any more work in the area, so she heads south to join a community of people who similarly live in their RV, van, or car. This more or less kicks off the main thrust of the narrative, which plays out as a mostly episodic journey of the jobs Fern works and the places she goes and the people that come and go from her life over the course of a year. All of which eventually builds to Fern reckoning in a way with how and why she came to be living like this. With the exception of David Strathairn, who plays a fellow nomad named Dave, most everyone Fern encounters are played by non-professional actors, including a few people who are playing lightly fictionalized versions of their real-life selves and actually do live this nomad lifestyle in real life. And I use the word lifestyle on purpose because in the movie, living this nomadic existence is kind of a choice. It is and it isn't to varying degrees depending on the person. But let's put a pin in that for now and come back to it. I think it's an inspired choice to use mostly non-professional actors. And the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced the movie wouldn't really work if they did it any other way. Not only are the non-professional actors on balance really, really good in this, particularly this woman named Swanky, but casting people who actually live like this sharpens the humanist angle of the movie. And had they cast more recognizable faces, it might have distracted from the point. So Franny McDormand and David Strathairn have to give really understated performances to make this work. And they certainly do. I knew going in that David Strathairn was in this, and it still took me a minute to realize it was him when he first appeared. This movie gives Frances McDormand her 6th and 7th Oscar nominations, 6th for acting and 1st for producing. And, you know, she gives the kind of incredible performance we've come to expect from one of our greatest living actors. Outwardly very different from her recent Oscar-winning performance in 3 Billboards, but inwardly maybe more similar than they might appear. Mildred in 3 Billboards and Fern in Nomadland are both emotionally lost at sea and coping with immense loss in the best ways they know how. Other craft stuff, I love the simple piano score. It's not an original score, it's previously published music by Italian composer Ludovico Einaudi, but I think it's really melancholic and effective. I noticed a lot of blue in the frame, both in Fern's costuming and in the production design, so much so that I have to believe that's more than just an aesthetic choice and that they're going for something there. Not sure what, but it's something I clocked. And speaking of what's in the frame, the Oscar-nominated cinematography from Joshua James Richards is just glorious, particularly in how he uses natural light and shoots landscapes. It reminded me a lot of Chibu Lubezki's photography and Terrence Malick's movies. And I'm far from the first person to call Nomadland Malick-esque, but apparently Terry Malick himself emerged from whatever forest he presumably lives in to give writer-director Chloe Zhao feedback on an early cut of the movie. And apparently he loved it. So, Malick inspired, Malick approved. For the non-professional actors, apparently they did a lot of the casting more or less on the spot. The day before they'd film a given scene, the crew would go out and meet people and film them with their iPhones and send the footage to director Chloe Zhao, who would then pick among the 50 or so options who she wanted to film for the movie the next day. Part of the reason Chloe Zhao couldn't do this casting legwork personally is because while they were in production on Nomadland, they were in pre-production on The Eternals, the Marvel movie due out later this year. So at times she had to step away from the $5 million movie they were currently shooting to remotely attend meetings about the $200 million movie that they were shooting next. Zhao is personally nominated for 4 Oscars, picture, director, adapted screenplay, and editing, and she's the current odds-on favorite to win 3 of those. It's not impossible she wins all 4, so yeah, she's probably going to have a really good night. And with The Eternals due out in November, she's probably going to have a pretty good year. Not only is Nomadland the best picture frontrunner, it's like the most definitive frontrunner we've had in maybe a decade. It won the Golden Lion, which is the top prize at the Venice Film Festival, and it won the People's Choice Award at the Toronto Film Festival. and I'm pretty sure it's the first movie to win both. The Golden Lion tends to skew more artful and esoteric, and the People's Choice Award tends to skew more populist and crowd-pleasing, so clearly this has broad appeal. Even the Golden Globes, a voting body that normally prioritizes glitz, glamour, and celebrity, couldn't resist giving Best Picture to this movie that has none of those things. And while I'm certainly pleased about its frontrunner status, I think it's an incredible movie and certainly deserving, I'm also pretty surprised by it. If I had seen this without any context, I would have guessed that its award season prospects would have followed the path of something like The Florida Project. Great movie, small scale, shining a light on an underseen population, probably a lot to clean up at the Independent Spirit Awards, but maybe not much more than a little love for its lead performance from the major award shows. And yet here we are. So, speaking of shining a light on an underseen population, as I said earlier, this movie does depict this nomadic existence as kind of a choice. In some cases.
I love this lifestyle. It is a lifestyle of freedom and beauty and connection to the earth.
And while this movie has gotten nearly universal acclaim, one criticism I want to address is that the movie might romanticize poverty in some people's eyes. That's notably a criticism I heard from people who have apparently, at one point or another, lived out of their car. For that reason, I'm certainly not in any position to criticize how they viewed the movie. I can only tell you what I personally saw in it, but as someone who's always been lucky enough to have had a roof over their head, I certainly don't envy anyone in this movie, and I wouldn't want to trade places with them. I would argue that humanizing these people and helping me empathize with them and helping me understand their reality is not the same thing as romanticizing their reality, but maybe that's a subtle distinction. For what it's worth, I think some of the movie's most powerful moments are when characters explain how they came to be living like this. There's a beautiful scene where people in the aforementioned RV living community sit around a campfire and each tell their story in turn. It's simultaneously completely heartbreaking, but also life-affirming. And while some of them are making a conscious choice to live on the road in an RV, it's usually barely a choice at all. One of the people that Fern has the most interaction with is a woman named Swanky. And when she tells Fern her reasons for being out there, it's basically a real-life version of the Tears and Rain speech from Blade Runner. It's just as devastating and beautiful.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
I've seen some really neat things, kayaking, all those places.
Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion.
Moose in the wild, a moose family on a river in Idaho.
Watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate.
Big white pelicans landing just 6 feet over my kayak on a lake in Colorado.
It's tradition for the Best Picture frontrunner to be subject to maybe a little more scrutiny than you might see for your average movie, which is totally fair. But the possible romanticization of poverty is not the main criticism I've seen. The loudest discourse around Nomadland is that it doesn't criticize Amazon enough. Again, Fern notably works at an Amazon warehouse as a seasonal worker. The Amazon logo is prominently displayed as she walks in, and there are several shots of her putting together those familiar boxes that have been delivered to my door 1,000 times. But it's treated as just one of many jobs that Fern works, and it's never explicitly acknowledged how Amazon and large corporations like it are arguably somewhat culpable for the economic conditions that led Fern here.
You're culpable.
And while it's tempting to roll my eyes and laugh that criticism off, as others have, I think it speaks to a larger issue, that Nomadland has ample opportunity for some biting commentary, but doesn't take it. Notably, the movie is adapted from a non-fiction book. Fern's a fictional character and is entirely a creation of the movie, but the source material was written by a journalist, Jessica Bruder, and apparently the book is more biting. Per Wilfred Chan, writing for Vulture, crucially, unlike the subjects in the book, Fern has no complaints about her jobs, including her time at Amazon. And because the film is primarily a character study of her, it exchanges Bruder's sharp indignation over capitalist exploitation for a muddled message about individual freedom that downplays the real stakes of gig labor. I think that's a pretty reductive read of the movie, but I take his point. To be fair, I was also expecting more of that movie. On first watch, I was looking for specific things like, what will this say about our economy, and about our system, and about people who fall through the cracks? What does it say about our system that even people who try to remove themselves from the system are still forced to participate in it, and things like that. But on second watch, I realized that while those are interesting questions, the movie isn't particularly interested in exploring them. Chloe Zhao told IndieWire that she made a specific effort to depoliticize the story, saying, quote, "I tried to focus on the human experience and things that go beyond political statements to be more universal. the loss of a loved one, searching for home, etc. And to the movie's credit, I think it's super effective with its focus on the human experience. Fern is an interesting character because her situation is due to a combination of economic downturn and personal loss, but those two things are inextricably tied. The movie's just more concerned with the latter. As I said, it's fairly episodically structured, at times a bit meandering, but that feels appropriate. This life doesn't have a goal or an end date. You just live day to day and you get by, and then you have to keep getting by. I did notice more of a structure on second watch, and that structure is built around exactly what Chloe Zhao highlighted in that quote: the loss of a loved one, searching for home. In the wake of loss, Fern seems to have some attachment issues. A scene she has with a dog early on sort of demonstrates that. But the story of the movie, to the extent that there is one, is Fern trying to work through those issues. I mentioned the inciting incident is her joining that RV community, and that's basically her dipping her toe back into personal relationships. She does allow herself to get close to some people, but it's usually fleeting, whether because the person moves on to their next thing or because Fern herself keeps the relationship at arm's length. Lindsay Doran is a renowned producer and script whisperer in Hollywood, and she's been making the rounds for the last decade or so, giving this TED Talk of sorts about storytelling and endings. And one thing I took away from her talk is that movies are about relationships. Simple and obvious observation, but it's true. Even this movie, ostensibly about a woman living alone in her van, is really about relationships. The other thing I took away from Lindsay Doran's talk is that the best way to end a movie is with the most important relationship in the movie. Rocky doesn't end with him going the distance, it ends with him and Adrian. Fargo doesn't end when Marge solves the case, it ends with her and Norm and their growing family. The final shot of every movie in the original Star Wars trilogy was a closing image of our heroes together. With that in mind, pay attention to the relationship featured in the final moments of Nomadland. If you buy into Lindsay Doran's point that movies end with the most important relationship in the movie, how does Nomadland's ending shift the focus of what the entire movie has been about all along? I call it a humanist movie because it focuses on people with most everything else stripped away. It shows that people can and do live complete, fulfilling lives without a house, without a traditional job, without most of the trappings of our modern life. But I think the ultimate thesis might be that there are only so many things that can be stripped away before we begin to feel incomplete. But even if you feel incomplete, you still just got to keep moving on down the road. Joshua James Richards. Joshua. It's my own name. You think I'd be better at saying it.